So thank you very much for coming back, and great session that just concluded, and I could not be happier to introduce to you Max Stier. Max is the CEO and the president of the Partnership for Public Service, and I would say for an audience like this, he is doing God's work. Let me tell you a little bit about who Max is and what he does. Max is the founding president and CEO of the Partnership for Public Service, and under his leadership, the partnership has been widely praised as a first-class nonprofit organization and thought leader on federal government management issues. Max previously worked in all three branches of the federal government. In 1982, he served on the personal staff of Congressman Jim Leach. Max clerked for Chief Judge James Oakes of the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Court in 1992, and he clerked for Justice David Souter of the United States Supreme Court in 1994. Between these positions, Max served as a special litigation counsel to the Assistant Attorney General, Ann Bingaman, at the Department of Justice. In 1995, Max joined the law firm of Williams & Connolly, where he practiced primarily in the area of white-collar defense. And most recently, Max comes from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, having served as the Deputy General Counsel for Litigation. He's a graduate of Yale University and Stanford Law School. He's a member of the National Academy of Public Administration, and he's also a member of the Administrative Conference of the United States and the National Advisory Board for Public Service at Harvard College. One of our professors who you've already heard from today, Sean O'Keefe, also serves on the Partnership for Public Service. They have an amazing array of programs and many interns that work for them. But more than any other nonprofit organization, they've been out in front, very strategically focused on questions about the federal workforce, really focused on how do we improve issues of human capital management. And those are the issues that are the closest to Max's heart. And one of the great things that Max has done, some of you may be familiar with it, you've perhaps seen it covered in the Washington Post, are the Service to America medals, more frequently referred to as the Sammys celebration. And I had the privilege on 2 different occasions to go to the Sammys, and it's just inspirational and aspirational, because what you're seeing are a series of federal public servants, many of them that are not heralded at all in their work, but who are so deeply committed to the particular missions of their organizations. And that passion comes through not only in the day-to-day work, but in how they try to break down silos across the government, how they try to work with one another, how they think about the beneficiary client for whom the public agency that they work for serves, and how Max buoys himself in times where the federal workforce is sometimes spoken down about, to say it charitably, is a real testimony to his own commitment and personality and drive to bring federal human capital management issues to a positive light. So Max, thanks so much for joining us. It's a pleasure.
So thank you. You are the few and the proud who have managed to imbibe what an extraordinary day. So Mr. Tanner, thank you for making this possible. David, in Napa, really, you've done just such a phenomenal job. I understand this is the 3rd of your series, and I'm, kudos to you for really building this, and it's an important thing. So I do want to doff my hat to Sean. As David said, he is on my board, but that's not the reason why I'm doing this. And he really is one of my public service heroes, someone who I think has phenomenal insight into how to make government work effectively. And when you talk about leaders, I do not know of any better leader than Sean. One of the things I deeply appreciated was when he was in government and I was just getting started at the partnership, he was managing all kinds of crazy things. And it didn't matter if I asked him to speak to a group of students or whatever else it might be. He made it happen despite all the craziness in his life. And I think it's indicative of the passion he has for public service. And it's also, I think, a good lesson, which is usually the urgent crowds out the important for most people in Washington and in leadership positions. And if you really care about the important, you'll still make it happen. And he did and does. So thank you, Sean, very much for your great leadership. So this is a tricky position to be in because you've all had just a great array of interesting inputs here. The title of this is focusing on the new public service, and I'm a contrarian. What can I say? And so I'm not going to talk about the new public service. I'm going to talk about the old public service. And this is something that Dustin, who I think wisely may not be here to hear this, not just because he hears me too much, but I don't think you should be finding, as he said earlier, the solution that you're applying to the problem. You have to understand what the problem is. And I think we live in an age in which everything that everyone has said up to now is correct. We do need to co-produce. Problems require multi-sector answers. We need to be thinking about government differently. And at the end of the day, though, in my view, again, to be a little provocative here, it's a little bit like the conversation around what kind of pair of tires you want when the body of your car is rusting out. And you gotta make sure that the body of your car is healthy. And we talk about public service today. Just a quick side note on the Partnership for Public Service, since you've given me so much time. I got the luxury of examining these things. But when we first started, the initial notion for us was that our name would be the Campaign for Public Service. And like good, but sort of ill-educated folks starting a nonprofit, we did do some market testing, and we decided, all right, let's think about what is Campaign for Public Service. Is that the right name for us? And we did a bunch of focus groups and some polling, and we found that people hated the name campaign. They saw that they thought it involved money, that it would be short term. So we said, forget that. And we decided, well, partnership. That more describes what it is that we want to do. But then on public service, we found that nobody thought about government service as public service anymore. And so we were faced with an interesting choice, which was we could have said, all right, people don't think about government as being public service anymore. Historically, they were synonymous terms, and they now, I think for many folks, doesn't even come up. But our view was, no, we still wanted to be called the Partnership for Public Service because part of our mission has to be to get people to understand that government service is in fact core public service. And I think that, and this I'm going to come back to, and I'm glad you're here, David, because then I can pester you directly. I think part of the Academy's responsibility now is to bring that term back into understanding, so that yes, we live in a different age. Yes, if you want to do foreign assistance or any number of other issues, you have a vibrant, important NGO community that you can go to. But the NGO community cannot replace the government. The government is our only tool for collective action that has the imprimatur of the public and the taxpayers' resources behind it. And to me, that is fundamentally what we're talking about here, is how do we have a healthy government? Healthy government means integrating with the rest of society effectively, but the core must be healthy. And that's what we're about at the Partnership for Public Service. I don't think I could do a better job than David did in describing the sorts of stuff that we're interested in. How many here, can I see a show of hands, that heard of the partnership at all before this? So a fair number of them, that's good to see. Sean, I'm glad you raised your hand. We're focused primarily on people issues, so we're looking at how do you get right talent into government, how do you make sure it's well led, because we see that as the primary lever for improvements of knowledge-based organizations. How do you make sure that you have the right performance information, because you can't, it's one of the big challenges. Again, I think it's one of the root causes of dysfunction in the public sector, is that you don't have good real-time performance information. And the old saw that you can't manage what you don't measure, I think is a real one, but it's harder in the government when you're seeking public goods. I think nonprofits face some similar issues, which we do because we're trying to influence government. But again, so it's right talent, leadership, performance information, making sure the systems are actually effective in supporting what you need to get done. And then finally, and very importantly, it's having a constituency in key stakeholder communities for effective government. Because again, one of the big challenges for our government is that it's become an insulated and isolated island. And what that means is that its processes have become disconnected to the larger talent market, and more fundamentally, key stakeholders aren't concerned about the health of the institution that is in fact fundamental to our democracy. So part of what we need is business, academia, et cetera, caring about effective government. So I'm going to come back around to this. So here's my roadmap of what I think I'm going to talk about. And that is, I'm going to talk about the old public service. I'm going to talk about a theory of the case about what's broken with our civil service. And then I'm going to talk about some of the opportunities, I think, to address what I see as broken. And I'm game to be interrupted or heckled or anything else like that any time. It'll make it more interesting for everyone else, so go for it. I told you a little bit about the partnership. I told you why I want to focus on this. So what's broken? And I'm going to describe what's broken. It's going to be an anatomy of the civil service in 4 parts. To be clear, and David raised this earlier, our current civil service does phenomenal things. So just last week we had the SAMIs program. The folks that were recognized there are unbelievable people who are doing great things for our society. Everything from the EPA DOJ team that was responsible for dealing with the Volkswagen fraud on the American public. You had the individual who runs the PEPFAR program, so literally there are 12 million people across the globe who are living because they're getting aid for AIDS, which is an unbelievable contribution of our country. The gentleman who runs the program for Syrian and Iraqi relief. I mean, these are people that are doing things you cannot do anyplace else in terms of scale and scope of impact. And so they're amazing. So when I talk about the anatomy of what's broken, what's unbelievable is that despite all the things that I'm going to talk about being broken, that federal workforce is still producing these things. But it won't be forever, and it won't keep up with the world around it. Okay, so the anatomy of what's broken in 4 parts here. So I'm going to start with the demographics. We are in a university here. You walk around campus, and it's phenomenal to see the energy. In the federal government today, there are about 6% of the federal workforce that's under the age of 30. 6%. When you think about that, in certain areas, there are 5 times as many people over the age of 60 as under the age of 30 in IT in the federal government. Now, the federal government spends, give or take, almost $90 billion in IT. Almost 80% of that goes to operations and maintenance. And what does that mean? It means keeping old systems alive, systems that include a system that uses 8-inch floppies that's like 50 years old that manages the nuclear stockpile. Very, very critical systems for our government. It's crazy. And we don't have the workforce that can change that. Now, Dustin raised something earlier about the United States Digital Service, and I'll come back to that as well. But if you look at the demographics of the workforce, everyone here ought to be troubled because it's not just the workforce of the future, it's not the workforce of now, especially when you talk about technology, but it's not just the technology that's relevant. A lot of conversation about the size of the federal workforce, and that's been a big debate, that's become very, very partisan. Paul Light just released a good report talking about, again, the multi-sector workforce and thinking about what the real size of it is. But what's fascinating is if you look at the numbers of the direct federal employees, federal government today is literally the same size as it was in the 1960s. And if you think about it, they're well in excess of over 100 million more Americans. If you look at where those federal workers are working, that's changed fundamentally because the federal government is very different today than it was in the 1960s. Think about TSA, just as an example of a new function that is being done by the federal government. And most folks don't realize, but you start breaking it down, you've got over a third of the civilian workforce of the federal government at DOD. You've got probably 15+% at VA. You've got another 10-12% at DHS. You got you go on and on. So just for the national security function now, you're looking at over 2/3 of the workforce is encompassed by that. So you actually see a shrinkage of dramatic scale, not only in relative terms to the size of the country, but also in absolute terms for most functions of government in terms of the direct federal workforce. Now, what's not shrunk in some instances, and some it has, is the full federal workforce, which is the conversation Paul Light has sparked. But part of the problem is that we don't have in the federal government the capability to choose what we outsource, nor how to outsource it, or how to manage those resources that are being brought in. So that's the fundamental problem. I think, again, the real issue here is not keeping the right capability inside. So on the demographic side, the federal government has enormous challenges. So number 2, morale of the federal workforce. And one of the very first things that we did at the partnership is I got question when we started the partnership. Was the question was, how are you going to know if you're successful? Like, what is your measuring stick? And that was a really profound question for us at the beginning, because we looked at the government and there was no measure of health. There was no measure of performance that we could use as a way of determining whether our activities were in fact producing the results that we wanted. And so one of the things we realized pretty quickly is that had to be part and parcel of our mission, was to create good performance information so that we could judge ourselves. In essence, we were creating the measuring stick for ourselves. And we're a B2B, we're trying to impact government. And we got lucky, because one of the first things that we were able to accomplish was persuading Congress to pass a law that required every federal agency to conduct an annual employee survey. And our theory of the case was as follows, and that is that if you look at the for-profit sector, obviously measurement's a lot easier because your goals are financial and there are a lot of tools for measuring financial success. But in the smart companies that were trying to actually improve their performance, there was a heavy reliance on looking at employee engagement, because there's a ton of social science research that says, and it's not a, it should be intuitive now for folks, but that is, you got more engaged employees, you're going to have better performance. In essence, you've got people giving their discretionary energy to the task at hand. And in a knowledge-based environment, that becomes even more fundamental. So our proposition was, well, if that's true in the for-profit sector, that must also be true, people are people, in the government. And in fact, it's even more important in the government because you don't have those financial metrics. And indeed, what we have found is that where we've been able to do some research, that there is that same very strong correlation. So what we did is we got a law passed that requires every federal agency to conduct an annual employee survey. We take that data, we rank agencies against themselves over time, so you can see how they're doing. Very importantly, we benchmark them against other agencies inside government, and then we try to benchmark against the private sector, because coming back to the first notion I put on the table, the federal government can't be an insulated and isolated island. It has to actually be part and parcel of the larger talent market, the larger technology world, et cetera. And so now, for going back to 2003 was the first time we put out our rankings. We've now got a pretty good data set. And you talked, again, Dustin, they can break down this information in very small components, and it's very powerful. And what we found was, by ranking, just like US News and World Report, that's very powerful, and pretty much any cabinet secretary that you ask would tell you where they were ranked in our best places to work rankings. And Congress now has hearings about agencies, about how their morale is, and instead of using anecdote, they actually have data. And it really is creating a real change. We've got a long ways to go, but it's actually driving a change. But what is the picture that it draws? And this is the coming around to the anatomy of what's wrong in the civil service, but the morale is not good in the civil service. And as I said earlier, the numbers go up and down, but benchmarked against the private sector, it's a real problem. And you look at the federal government today, and it's about 17 points lower than a good private sector benchmark that a company called Sirota has built for us. And that's huge. 17 points is a gigantic difference. And there are, in fact, not very many agencies in the government that exceed the private sector benchmark. Most are well below that. And it should be troubling. And the bottom of the pack for large agencies is the Department of Homeland Security. We ought not to want any agency not to have an engaged workforce, but my own view would be that's not one of them that I'm really excited about, having disengaged employees. But it's not just the overall engagement that's problematic. What's fascinating about the survey is it provides a very broad and deep view into what is wrong in our government. And so, coming back again to David's point about the SAMMys, part of our proposition is that any healthy organization has to recognize good work. I've never seen, again, Dave and I were just talking about kids. I'm not so good about this always, but positive reinforcement clearly is a better motivator than the negative. In the federal government today, it's all negative, and people talk about risk-averse federal employees, and I think there's a reason for it. And they're risk-averse because when something goes wrong, they get in trouble, and when something goes right, they don't get much good. And if you look at, again, the numbers, you're looking at now a 22-point gap between the private sector and the federal government. So it's about 46% of federal employees will say that their good work is recognized, whereas it's 68% in the private sector. And that divide should be incredibly troubling, and we need to build more opportunities of bright spot analysis and of recognition of the things that we want to see more of, or we're not going to get them. We had as one of our presenters, Dean Kamen, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with him, but he's probably the most extraordinary inventor of the day, 440 patents, whatever it is, including the Segway, et cetera. And he has an amazing riff that he did not use at our event, which I thought he would, which is that, if you celebrate people who can bounce the ball, really well, then that's what you get. And what we ought to be celebrating are public servants and mathematicians, et cetera. And so that's his proposition, and I think it's a right one. And if we want a government that's going to provide us the best-in-class services, we need to recognize it when it does. And that's something that is a responsibility that the government holds, but it has to be held by a broader group in addition just to the government. So you have issues around overall engagement, you have issues around recognition, but let me offer you a third look at the morale of the federal workforce. And one of the numbers that I find phenomenally troubling is it's question 17 of 80 plus questions, and it basically says this, which is, do you believe that you can reveal a violation of law or ethics without fear of retaliation? And to me, that's a real key question that every leader ought to be seeing themselves responsible for, because at the end of the day, in any large organization, bad things are going to be happening. And the key to, I think, being a good leader, or one of the keys, is to be able to get your people to bring the bad information up so that it can be actionable. And if I rewind the tapes and think about what happened during the Obama years, I should start by saying that number is 59% across the federal government. So, little over half of federal workers think they can reveal a violation of law or ethics. This is not something wrong. It's a violation of law or ethics without fear of retaliation. To me, that is a damning, damning number. Now, that's the overall average, and one of the more important things with these numbers is to look at the average, but then to break it down and look at the subunits. So to give you an example, at Secret Service, it's only 1 out of 3 employees believe that they can reveal a violation of law or ethics without fear of retaliation. And that's a law enforcement organization. You got it, that's beyond unbelievable in my view. And again, that's what the data says, and people say, well, it's subjective. And I'm like, yeah, but that's all that matters. It's the subjective view that matters. There's no objective of what, someone's going to bring you bad information because they believe they can do it safely. There's no, the subjective is everything. But it ought to be troubling to people. So back to the Obama administration, if you look at the things that went wrong on the macro scale, I think pretty much all of them, I think you can reasonably draw to this data point. So if you think again about one of the most problematic ones, the VA, and what happened in Phoenix, in a 330,000 person organization where they've been given a performance metric that they don't feel like they can actually meet, someone's going to cheat. The real question is, what happens next? What do their coworkers do? Where does that information go? Does it go someplace quickly and get resolved fast so that the culture of the organization rejects that behavioral response? And the answer is it didn't. And that's because people didn't feel like they can bring up information. So that's the VA example. Think about IRS, same issue. If you think about what happened in Cincinnati, information did not come up to where it needed to be quickly. I would argue the same thing with GSA, which was the first of the scandals that the Obama administration had to deal with. So again, just to look at this demographically, the morale, and then I would argue that the structure is the third area of great problem for our federal workforce. And if you think about it, we have a government that is largely a legacy institution. It's an organization that was designed for issues, events, and in a different era. And it hasn't kept up with the world around it. And I think that, again, is one of the more important sort of concepts to be thinking about what we need from our government. But the rules of our government were created in a totally different era. So example here would be we have a 1949 pay system. And so I would ask of you, any of you, do you know of any organization that is operating under the same rules for pay as it did in 1949 and is doing it successfully? And I would be like, That would be remarkable if anyone could come up with a counterexample, but clearly not. And the reality is that the world has changed dramatically. Our government has not kept up, and the structures and rules of our government have not kept up. So the pay system, which is one of the areas where we're pushing on, was all designed about internal equity. So you have this imaginary level of work. You probably all, sort of the choir here, it's the GS system, GS13 if you're a GS13 physicist, if you're a GS13, physical therapist, you name the profession, you're paid according to the same pay schedule and you're paid the same. And it's nonsense because in a professional world, that doesn't exist and can't exist anywhere else. It's not a reflection either of the needs of the work itself or of the labor market. And we, again, have this vestigial system that is driving the activity of the organization and the talent acquisition and the talent retention that is fundamentally mismatched against the needs of the organization. And, you think about this, yay, Dustin, okay, like I've been calling out good things about you too here, so. So for me, one of the primary examples of this is, again, back to the VA, where there's been a lot of important attention to trying to help and trying to fix problems that are there. There are about 170 medical center directors or larger area directors in the VA, and if you're in the private sector running a medical system of that sort, you're going to be paid upwards of $1 million plus. And if you're in the VA, you're going to be paid, $200,000, just say, order of magnitude. And it makes no sense. And so one of the things to me that I think would be one of the biggest opportunities for smart investment is you don't have to get to $1 million. There are reasons why people will do those jobs and still be paid under market, but not 5 times under market. And if they're going to do it, they're not going to stay for the length of time that you need them to stay in order to be able to do the transformation that's necessary. But again, I think where we might see some success is pulling out some pieces of this. But the structure itself of our what is in fact, the rules themselves are enormously problematic in terms of the system we have, because they were, again, very smart for the era in which they were designed, but do not apply for the world that we live in today. So the fourth piece that I would focus on in terms of what's broken for our civil service is on leadership. And here it's come back to a theme that I started with, and that is that I fundamentally think if you think about the root causes of why our government isn't as healthy as it needs to be, I mentioned earlier that very difficult to have real-time performance information. I'll come to Congress in a second here. But one of the issues is you have short-term political leaders that aren't aligned to the long-term needs of the organizations they run. So when I say that, what I mean is that if you're in office for 18 months or 2 years, and this comes back to a structural issue, and when you have 4,000 political leaders and 1,100 of them being Senate-confirmed folks that don't get into place for a very long period of time, what that means is that the people in those jobs aren't paying attention to the long-term health of the organizations they're running. So, like, I'm at the partnership, Terry's at Napa. She's thinking about the health of Napa. That's one of you think about that as a core part of your responsibility. Very, very few political appointees in our government do. And I don't think that has to be that way, but this is one of the leadership failings that I think exists in Washington, and I use Washington in quotes because much of government is not in DC, but the political piece is for sure. Policy is king, and everybody is incentivized to focus on either policy creation or crisis management, not on actually making their organizations run better. And so we really do need to see a change in leadership on the executive branch for sure, that leaders see their job as including at minimum the health of the organization as they run. When I first started the partnership, I brought in someone from the private sector who was phenomenal, who's now the number 2 at the World Wildlife Fund, and her first observation was, who owns leadership in the government? And this, again, is another structural issue, which is there's very little, folks have talked about this, enterprise perspective. You look at Dustin, who is is a one-man army, but it's a big job. And there's really, the idea that 40 or 50 people in the management function, at OMB can really have, full field of view of the, incredibly complicated governments. I think it's crazy. There ought to be a bigger investment there. We need that enterprise perspective. But on leadership, we need leaders in government to actually see that that is their responsibility. And again, one of the fascinating things, one of the projects we've worked on, the partnership, is on presidential transition, and it'd be great to talk about that if that's a topic of interest. But one of the things we discovered is that for the top jobs, there are no job descriptions for the top jobs in government that at least are available to the political campaigns as they come in. No sense about what the core capabilities are of those leaders. No performance plans for those folks. I mean, again, individual agency leaders do this occasionally, but that's not the norm. So there's a leadership void when it looks at the executive branch. Well, there's also a leadership void in Congress, and I would argue that's a third area of root cause of dysfunction in the federal government. And Congress really we did a report on this, which was, my title was Congress's Contributions to Management's Dysfunction in the Executive Branch. That didn't make it on the cover, but that's the way I think of it. But there really are 4 ways that Congress, in my view, has fiduciary responsibility with respect to the executive branch. And we heard conversation earlier around the budget piece, which is clearly fundamental. Again, like the pay system, no private sector entity could possibly run itself or even believe that it was running itself. It didn't know what resources it had. Leave aside, the idea of capital budgets or whatever else it might be. But we literally in an environment where, the federal government buys slices of bread when it knows it's eventually going to eat the loaf. I mean, it just makes no sense and doesn't know when it's going to get the money to buy those slices of bread. So it's crazy. So budget is one area. Confirmations is a second area where, again, much of the problem is situated in the executive branch, but the Senate is responsible for the advise and consent function, and again, rarely prioritizes or gets through the leadership that it needs to, and uses those leaders as bargaining blocks and bargaining chips, and that's a massive problem. A third is an oversight. Again, rarely does Congress use its oversight authority to actually probe and find not just the problems, but the solutions. Again, coming back to the bright spot analysis, it should see its function as finding solutions, not finding problems. And fourth is the underlying authorization, because part and parcel of the challenge for government agencies is lack of clarity around what the real goals are. And so I would argue that, again, Congress is one of the root causes of dysfunction in the executive branch, and the lack of leadership there is enormously problematic. But it's not unique now to government. So I've talked about the executive leadership in Congress. I think we all own this. And it comes back to the issue that it's our institution. And I believe that business, if you think about how they engage with government, they do the same thing that the leaders do inside, which is they focus on policy. What do nonprofits do? There are 1.6 million nonprofits. And we're basically alone, like NAPA, us. There's just next to nobody doing what we're doing. And all those nonprofits are concerned about issues where, at the end of the day, the federal government is the 800-pound gorilla. So if they're talking about poverty or the environment or whatever else, national security, making the government better at its responsibilities is actually the highest leverage type of investment that would be possible. But the nonprofits instead work on policy pushes and not actually on the execution capability of government. They don't even think about it. And I will come around to this, which is I believe that universities do the same thing. I think the academy is equally guilty of not engaging with what I think is a fundamental responsibility, and that is to care for the health of our core democratic institutions, including our government. And so I will not only be a scold here, I will actually offer some thoughts and ideas. So first, I want to take a second to talk about a few bright spots that I believe that are out there. And one of them is Dustin, who I think has been a really important continuity and leader in government to help new political teams as they come in understand not only why they should be focusing on these issues, but how they should be doing it. And I do think that one of the missing competencies in much of the federal workforce, in the career workforce, and understandably, is the ability to really lean in and to be risk takers. And I think Dustin is doing that around the management agenda and pushing in very important ways in an area where we've had so many acting people actually that should be an opportunity for the career people to say, guess what, I know what to do, and I'm going to do it. I'm not going to wait for the next people to ultimately arrive whenever they arrive. I'm going to actually lead forward, and I think that's something that we need to grow and support in the federal workforce. But there are some interesting legislative things that are going on. So I think I mentioned the VA committees, the Indian Affairs committees. You're starting to see committees of jurisdiction across Congress notice that things that they're responsible for are breaking and are not working right. And I think that's actually very promising. Just today, there were 4 bills that were voted unanimously out of committee at the Government Affairs Committee that are around civil service reform issues. And to me, the most important and interesting one is a bill that would permit agencies to directly hire recent grads up to a certain cap, with some extra things that were added in that I'm not loving. But the point is that it made it out of committee, and it has a shot, at actually getting done. And it would be very important because, the whole system needs to be fixed. But in the meanwhile, we better take every opportunity to find other things that will get us closer to where we need to be. And as I mentioned earlier, the recent grad issue is profound in our federal government. And right now, a direct hire is I think the only way that in the near term that something can be done of consequence. So there's some interesting legislative things. The Trump administration has done 2, in my view, interesting things. One is they've actually, and Dustin referenced a little bit about this, about buying into the Obama management framework, but they've also bought more generally into some of the IT innovations, and that includes the digital service that Dustin referenced earlier, 18F, and more generally understanding that it's a really critical area for the administration to lean in on, because it's really responsible for a lot of what's holding back our government. Again, I think most of the IT stuff ends up being a talent issue fundamentally, but it's a really critical area of attention. At the same time, they're missing close to half of their CIOs, their full-time CIOs. There's a lot of stuff that they're not doing that they ought to be doing. And I think there's the classic disconnect between some people in the center and then the folks that actually are doing the stuff in the agencies. And that's a more normal problem, but it's a real one for them as well. But I think that's a bright spot. One of the important things the president did very early on is to issue an executive order that directed agencies to think about how they could transform, reorganize to be more effective. And this is a process that Dustin is running government-wide. And I think that's an enormously positive possibility. And I say possibility because execution is the name of the game. Getting this stuff done is unbelievably hard, and that execution capability is missing in many agencies. In fact, probably all of them have shortfalls of consequence. But the important thing to my mind is that this was started early. The runway is so short that unless you get it moving quickly, you just don't have time to get anything done. And it was started at the top. And I think that's also fundamental in a crazy busy world. You need to have the push from the top in order for big things to happen. So those are some of the bright spots that I see out there. But I'll bluntly say, not nearly enough. Like if we really want to see a government that keeps up with the world and a world that's increasingly dangerous, we need to see a lot more. So I want to come back to universities and what I think this community could and should do. So when I think about a university, I see, again, in my own view, at least 3 assets here. You have your students, you have your faculty, and you have your overall convening and intellectual capability as a community. So on the faculty side, one of the things that I think would be transformational for government, as well as for this university and universities more generally, is to see a sustained and organized effort to have faculty spend sabbaticals inside government. And so there is a legal provision, the IPA statute, the Intergovernmental Personnel Act, that permits this. There are professors that do this on one-offs, but there's been no effort to systematize that. I mean, I say systematize, I mean to think strategically about how do you get the right talent to come from a university into government? How do you onboard them effectively? Because part of the real challenge for them is it's a very alien environment. And how do you create a community inside government, and then when they return back to their campuses, so that there's a community of professors that are connected, who have that shared experience of working in government and the shared, hopefully, desire about seeing themselves as part of the change process to give us the government that we want. I think that would be incredibly powerful, as I say, on all sides. The professors would learn a ton. They would provide their universities with real insight about a critical democratic institution. The government would gain their knowledge as well as a pipeline of the talent that they're likely to interest in government. And if you did it right, I think you would see a real change in all respects in some very positive ways. Second area, obviously, is the students themselves. I think that the faculty investment, bluntly, is more important because it's more lasting. Because if you get a faculty member to spend the time in government and they go back to their university for 10, 15, 20, whatever years it is, that means there's 20 years that they're going to be teaching their students, hey, I had the coolest year of my career, working in, the Department of Agriculture or HUD or wherever else it might be. And guess what? I have a friend from that time who I can connect you with, or whatever else it may be. But that connectivity would be very powerful. But in addition to that, I think universities ought to be doing more to help their students navigate what is a horrendous process. And again, I believe that all forms of public service are valuable, but I think the government service piece, there's a responsibility that universities have to invest more in that, because it's not working. It's not working today. And in order for that to happen, in order for it to work, you do need a bigger investment. Students are not used to having to go through an obstacle course, not the best ones. The best ones are used to being the hunted rather than the hunter. And it's really important for universities to provide resources for the best students so that they can have an easier path. It will never be easy, but an easier path in. And that involves a different kind of career counseling. I think it involves a real presence and activity with the alumni network in a way that I don't think it usually happens. And it's usually going to involve an investment around internships, because that's really, many more people are willing to spend a summer exploring something that they might not think that they want to do long term than they are going to take the plunge for something that they see as a real step in their career. So that would be a second area. So faculty, students. And the third is something that I would argue is a souped up version of this conversation today. And that is that it comes back to what I raised earlier about, Dustin fighting a relatively lonely battle with, insufficient troops. And that is that there are a lot of big issues that are going to impact our government. And I don't think that the government has the resources internally to really put their arms around it. So as little as there is in the way of resources to think horizontally, cross-governmentally, to integrate, there are even fewer resources to be thinking about the long term. And so, you take an issue like data that Dustin is focused on, or artificial intelligence, or whatever it may be, it's going to have profound impact on our society, and it ought to have profound impact on our government. And we ought to be thinking about what that impact is and getting ahead of it and making the right investments around talent and otherwise. And it's, I think, next to impossible for the government to do it for itself. But a university could. A university could say, here are 5 game-changing issues for our society and for how government ought to run. And we're going to take on one of them, or we're going to be part of a coalition of universities that are going to take on all 5. And we're going to draw not just the public policy community, but we're going to draw the entire university into the conversation about how, what is the right vision for government, and what's the right plan of attack, and how will they execute on it. And they'll involve practitioners, so not just academics. And that would be, again, another big game changer. Those are like my recommendations for the university here. Easy, I'm in the, advice is cheap. Doing it is the hard part, but that's what I get to do since I was invited here, is to offer that advice. I could go on, but I'm not going to. I look out at eyes that have seen too much and have absorbed too much information. So with permission, I will open it up to questions.
Absolutely. We have 2 mics, one on each side of the room.
We have one back here, one brave soul.
First of all, I want to say thank you very much. I enjoyed your presentation thoroughly. I finished my MPA in 1992.
Yeah.
And in 1992, people were talking about the government's getting old and X year, X percentage of the population will be eligible for retirement. You're getting into the profession at a good time. And we're still having that same HR conversation X number of years later.
Yeah.
So I get that. There's a number of different reasons why people are still working that should be retired. So my question to you is, how do we, well, let me give you one more thing. So what I figured out a long time ago is public affairs, public administration programs figured it out ahead of other programs. They figured out, we train people to work in government, we need to cut a deal. So NASPA and the Office of Personnel Management got together less than 10 years ago and said, we have the PMI program, it's now called PMF, but we need a program specifically to get public affairs students into government. So they created that Pathways program, just like you're talking about. Other programs haven't caught on to that just yet. They still use the traditional PMF. So my question to you is it really the government's fault that there's an HR problem? Or is it universities, programs that haven't said, we need to give them the solution? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I will claim fault not back to '92, but we certainly, when we first started banging the retirement drum and talked about the great outflow of talent that was likely, et cetera. And what ended up happening is, in fact, the federal workforce did get older. People did stick around a lot longer. They've not retired. We don't have good quality metrics of personnel in government. And so, I think one of the great challenges is that I actually think there has been an outflow of some of the best talent. And what's even more problematic is I think that government workforce has become more and more insular. So just to walk down that road, and I'll come back to your question, you look at, for example, a senior executive service, 92% comes from within government. 8% move agencies once they become an SESer. And this, data may be a little old, but truth is it's the same phenomenon. And so what's happening is, it's not just about age. I'm getting older and older and thinking that, like older and older doesn't seem so old to me anymore. But it's really, I think, fundamentally about the connectivity. It's really about understanding, we talk about co-production, et cetera. You can talk about co-production from the context of saying government and private sector and different levels of government need to work together. My belief is you would actually see much better co-production is it not that the actual organizations work together, that the people moved around. So that the people in government have had experience in industry, who have had experience in different levels of government, and have walked in each other's shoes, have the relationships, know who they should talk to, et cetera. So I actually think that's really fundamental. Now to your question, I generally look at the world through rose-colored glasses. Yours are even nicer than mine, because I don't think that the public policy schools have figured this out. I don't think there really is a good channel of talent from public policy schools into the federal government. I think that the Pathways program didn't work. It was an effort to fix a problem that failed. And we're partly responsible. And you asked who is responsible? I think everyone is, because at the end of the day, we're all suffering the consequences of it. So we all have a part to play in trying to fix this. I think, one of the issues, it's such a closed, insular system that there's a pronounced, status. It's all focused on keeping and holding what's already there. The people who are inside don't have the same incentive to want change. We need other voices to be speaking up and bluntly breaking open the system. And so I think universities need to speak up, and not just NASPA. It ought to be viewed as a university-wide issue. The federal government is the largest employers of engineers in our country. I mean, so yeah, we need public policy school, graduates, but the federal government needs the big data people. It needs everybody. There's not like a profession that doesn't exist in the federal government. So universities should see this as something that they're all in on. The PMF program is hurting. Sean was, a PMI, early generation, and I think that shaped his life. And you look at people like Sean who came in, and it's such a tiny program relative to the whole size of the government, and yet it's had outsized impact. And yet no one's really looked at trying to actually why it's not working. How do you boost it up? The reason why, I'll tell you a story, it's called the PMF program and not the PMI program right now, is that Harvard did a set of sessions around the future of the civil service that we participated in very early on in the tenure of the partnership. And the OPM director at that point, who I will not name, attended, and we had an idea. And our idea was, it's terrific to have the PMI program, but might we have another channel into the government for experienced people, so that you would have an easy entry into government and for mid-career people or second career people. As one of our theories was, like, if there are other retirements are going to happen, it's not just the recent grads going to take their job. What about the people from the private sector that are retiring and retiring young, who come with great skills? Maybe you should create a new pipeline in for them. And we suggested that it would be called the President's Management Fellows Program. The then OPM director, who came to this conference at Harvard, said, what a great idea. The only thing that survived of the idea was a change of name. And it's just an object lesson about how hard these things can be to actually change. But what I would say is, it's not fixed for public policy school grads. My bet is, Maxwell School is the premier public policy school, Candy School. You look at your numbers, most people aren't going into government. They can't be. We do not have 6%, under the age of 30, if that were the case. And there are lots of reasons for it. Some are good. The fact that there's now other diverse options of seeking the public good. But, as important as the contracting community is, the way they pitch themselves to best-in-class talent is to say, come to us because this is the way you'll serve the public. We work for the government. But fundamentally, they're organizations that are designed to maximize profit. And I think they're an important part of the ecosystem. I also believe the experience is not the same thing as working in the institution whose purpose is to pursue a better country. And I think that's important for all of us. I think it's important for the contractors, and I think they would say the same thing, that they need good counterparties inside the government. I mentioned this earlier. The money we spend and waste on contracting is not an absolute sum. It's the fact that we don't have the people inside who know when we should be contracting, what's the best contracting, and how to use those contracting resources effectively. That's where the public gets hurt. So, I don't know, but it's all of us.
Hello? Okay. I'm Steve Haggerty, and I wear a couple hats. One, I am, I guess, a government contractor, right? And we have lots of contracts with the government. And two, I'm also a mayor of a city.
I listen.
And so, my take, and I hear your point about businesses, sort of making money and stuff. I actually think we do, my experience, and I'm curious if you know the data behind this, that we do a better job actually selling public sector work, even though we're sort of, an arm's length removed from that, about the importance of this work and how rewarding this work is. And there's no better way to spend your time than working on something that's benefiting, the collective good. And I worry, because we talked about the president as well. I thought under President Obama, he very much had that sort of message about, I thought, the value of public service. Not so much sure about this new president. And so I'm curious with the data in terms of, it's obviously a small number, much smaller than I would have thought before listening to you, of millennials that work for the government. Have we seen the actual number of applicants to the government go up, though? And what's the millennial makeup of the total number of applicants? And are they applying, or are they just sitting it out altogether? And if that's the case, should we have some marketing campaign about why there's no better way to spend your time than doing this kind of work?
Yeah. So all good questions, and I don't have, this is my own judgment, I don't have good data on this, but I would say, in general, the private sector does a better job of selling the public service message to prospective talent than the government does itself. I mean, for one thing, they invest in it, and they invest in ways that the government doesn't. They show up on campus at the right time. Like, they don't show up at, springtime, they show up when the people are actually looking for jobs. I mean, you can go on and on and on with a list. But to my mind, it's like no contest. I mean, the private sector, there are exceptions to that, but again, as a general matter, I think that's true. I would, like every number I gave you, well, so back to President Obama. One of the first things he said is he wanted to make government service cool again. Now I can say this, every number I gave you, he owns. The anatomy of brokenness in 4 parts, those are all things that were under his watch and that he did not fix and that he had a part in creating. So I can, have my concerns about this administration's, certain, whatever it is, but, at the end of the day, President Obama was there for 8 years and thus is what he wrought this. And so, and my view is that he's responsible. He was the President of the United States. He was the leader of our country and he was the leader of our government. And one of the fundamental responsibilities, in my view, of the President is to make sure our government is healthy. And that's not just saying, I want to make government cool again, but actually investing in it. And again, hard jobs, crazy world, on and on and on and on. But I think the long term, this is a big part of the ball game. And that's what we need to expect our presidents to do and hold them responsible for. How to get there, very hard, but there are things like I think we're doing that are steps in the right direction. But we have a long distance still to travel. You asked also about just the data on applicants. I don't love the data on applicants for the following reason, is that technology has changed everything. So like almost every federal agency, their problem is not the number of their problem isn't the small number of their applications, their problem is too many applicants. They're all struggling with the fact, and they do crazy things. They'll like open up a job, they call them vacancies, which I hate, a job opportunity, and they'll open it up at midnight and close it down at 12:05 or whatever else it is, because they know they got to do public and notice whatever else it is, but they want to shorten the time period so they can manage the flow into them. So the issue really, in my mind, is it is absolutely important to excite and interest more top talent in government service, but the primary problem is the government doesn't take advantage of the talent that's already available to it. And I think the public policy schools is the canary in the coal mine, because if you look at a group of students that are in school in some substantial measure because they think about government as the place they want to go, and how difficult it is for those people to make it, and what can we expect for people who it's not even on their radar screen, which is the general norm. Not going to happen. So I don't think pumping up the application numbers is really what we need right now. We need to fix the way that government imagines its responsibility, the leadership's responsibility in terms of dealing with talent. By and large, government weighs the value of prior experience way much more than capability, and that's part of the problem. I think there's a challenging conversation about the way we implement veterans preference. It's not veterans preference itself, but the way it gets implemented. That's a big issue that has to be addressed. But the core issue is leaders believing that this is their responsibility. Because unless and until they do, none of this gets fixed. Or that's too strong. Not enough of it gets fixed. So that would be my sense of this. Question? Yeah.
For those of us who've had a romance with data, you fed our appetite.
Okay.
And this question may be beyond the work of the partnership, and if it is, please pass.
Much is.
I'm very curious if we were to factor in the nonprofit sector with government and business and the statistics about satisfaction. In New York right now, nonprofit sector's employees outstrip the employees on Wall Street.
Yeah.
In many of our cities, the largest employer is no longer the company, but a university like this. Mm-hmm. And then the second thing, which I find would be a very interesting piece of data in light of our theme of citizenship today, is there a difference among those employees in the 3 sectors in terms of how many of them vote? or how many of them also engage in civic participation? My gut tells me that nonprofit sector has a high level of participation in civic activities. I mean, nonprofits are civic activities.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen any statistical data.
That's fascinating, and your instinct was correct. I'm not going to be able to help you very much on some of these. My intuition would be similar to yours in terms of expectations around the nonprofit sector, but it would be an awfully interesting question to have answered. And it is pretty, it's a very large, section of the workforce. One of the things that I'd be interested, I don't know the answer to the question about comparative, civic engagement, voting patterns. Some of that stuff ought to be available. I will say that in government, one of the more interesting things, I have some anecdotal, points of view of this. So if you talk to members of Congress that have high percentages of federal workers, by and large, they will say that they don't operate as a real constituency inside their district. So when issues come up, they don't get a whole bunch of calls and stuff like that, which I think, so again, it is data, but it's not comprehensive. But I have heard this a bunch of times. What I do know, and I think this is another broken part of our government, is that there's no real internal communication function, and there's no good way of communicating to the federal workforce. So again, going back to President Obama, one of the things that he did, and I thought it was a good thing just 7 years too late, or 6 years too late, is he brought the senior executive service together. And again, think about this, it's sort of like you're running an organization and you've not ever spoken to your top tier of people about what their vision ought to be, what your vision is for them, how they work together, et cetera, et cetera. It was a real challenge to actually get a list of the full SES. So pretty profound, issue here, I think. So I think there's just not the basic, management infrastructure that ought to be there. I mean, you think about it. No job descriptions, no performance plans at the top, this incredible disconnect between political and career. Your career people who are supposed to be the executives are selected for subject matter expertise. They don't move around at all. It's all insular. I mean, you go on and on and on. You're like, whoa. And this is the institution we need to deal with the most troubling problems. And I will say, when there is a crisis, it does incredibly well because the mission drive is so profound for these people. But we're not making the progress on the longer term stuff that we need, and we can't operate. We're burning out the resource too.
In regards to the first question, was just in the government and business.
Yeah.
Statistics you gave about
Yeah.
morale and,
Yeah.
Is there a comparable statistic for the nonprofit?
Not that I'm aware of. Again, if you ask me, I have a lot of wishes I would make, and one of them would be, I think the stuff that we're doing at the partnership, we focus exclusively on the federal level, although we are now focusing on federal government's intersection with the state and local. In my view, there ought to be a partnership-like organization at every level of government. Internationally, there's a lot of stuff going on. Dustin's one of the few people in the U.S. government talking to, other governments and is facing the same kinds of issues. And I think in the nonprofit sector, they ought to be doing something like Best Places to Work. And we've pitched that. Again, I've done so, but I'm freelancing. It's not my day job. But the nonprofits face the same kinds of issues of measuring impact, right? And having data that can be benchmarked. So I think this ought to be done. I try to do it the independent sector, which is one of the umbrella groups for nonprofits. I try to get them to do it. I got a couple foundations interested, and then the presidents moved or left their jobs. So it's like one of those things that I've not seen happen, but I'm pretty full up on my day job, so it's hard for me to push on this. But it should be done, and maybe some university does that, because again, it really is powerful information. It says a lot, and it ought to be then be comparable. Like you could look at, people with environmental interests, they can look at, all right, what's the health of the organization if I'm interested in environmental stuff? Do I go to New York City's Department of Environment? Do I go to the EPA? Do I go to the NRDC and let me compare data. You have, Glassdoor, which is pretty good, but that's like an anecdote. Yeah, thank you.
I think we have time for one more question, if there is one more.
I thought 16 different ways to try to ask this question nicely, and I have yet to.
Don't be mean.
I have not formulated it yet in my head. Sorry.
Go for it. I'm on my way back to DC, so it's
it
okay.
seems interesting to me that we've talked a lot about people who work in federal agencies, right?
Yeah.
But you've brought up a really interesting point here in a couple different ways of the role of congressional staffers.
Yeah.
Right? And so you say, well, we have a transition every 4 years when a new president, or every 8 years when a president comes in. Well, every 2 years, we have a transition with congressional staffers coming in. And I find that we get, as a contractor who works on the receiving end, working with agencies, get legislation that sometimes doesn't make a lot of sense, or it's 2,000 pages long, hypothetically, right?
Right.
Is there an effort to educate congressional staffers about some of the agencies? You mentioned oversight, but I think there's a real disconnect in them understanding how these agencies even function.
Yes, yes, and
And
yes.
so
this is your music to my ears. Yes, I think you're entirely right. About a year and a half ago, we did our sort of starting research on trying to understand, again, as I said earlier, Congress's contributions to management dysfunction in the executive branch, and this is one of the issues that we identified, and we are just now starting programming to try to address that. So again, we're learning. I mean, like, the reason why I talked about what I think is wrong is I think that then shapes what the right solution set is. And we're learning more about what is wrong, and I think you put your finger on a fundamental one that is, in fact, it shouldn't be surprising because it's just like it is for everybody else. The government is a mystery. The people who are supposed to be doing the oversight really have no idea about what the real problems are. This came home to me in the most dramatic way. We've done a lot of work with the Veterans Affairs committees, but I was in a meeting with the staff director of one of the committees, and he basically said to me, look, there are rats falling out of the ceiling. There are patients being duct taped to chairs. We're hearing these awful, horrible stories, and we're asking the VA what they need in order to be able to address them, and we're getting nothing back. And we're filling the void, because my view was that their answers were bad answers in terms of, and that was his perspective. My view was actually the VA wasn't really answering the questions. I was testifying on the same panels, and bluntly, like, the administration representative wasn't answering the questions, and the testimony wasn't answering the questions, and there are multiple reasons for this, whatever it might be, but you didn't have that sharing of information or that understanding. And it varies, at least, and again, I don't know if it's still the case, but it was in the last administration, but the VA wasn't sending anyone under IPAs to the Hill. They were not doing it at that point. And again, I'm not pretending that's the perfect solution, but pretty darn good to have someone there who's from the agency who can share information. Administrations don't like that a lot because there's a back channel of information. But I think congressional affairs, public affairs offices, and I'll be direct about this, OMB often, it's the Heisman. They are about, like, their view is protection means not getting information out, and I think that's a giant mistake. So I agree, 100%, 110%, even though that's not allowed. I still agree that much, and I'm hoping we can do more. Bluntly, part of our challenge is funding. We got to find, but we have a foundation that's going to give us seed money to do some of this. So, but yeah, big problem. So listen, I can just say thank you all for your patience. Obviously, you can see I don't care about these issues at all. So I appreciate David for inviting me here. This is a beautiful campus and a wonderful institution. So I'm glad to have a chance to see you. So thank you. Thanks.
"5 minutes and introduce Lynn Tanner, who's the benefactor of this series and who had the wisdom and the vision in his own leadership and philanthropic generosity with his wife Margaret to endow this series. Lynn, would you like to come up for a moment?
Well, it's my pleasure to be here. I want to just share with you how pleased I am with what I've seen today. Margaret and I talked about this close to 10 years ago. and how we would fund it, and what was it about. So let me just quickly give you a little background, because we've talked a lot about context today. So visualize a young guy who's just finished his MBA, or MPA, which was a combined process, but is a manager for a large multinational organization, at that time Pan American, being assigned to be in charge of 3 countries in East Africa, and I didn't even know where Nairobi was. The reality is that I went back to New York, and I was a senior financial analyst, because that was my background, was economics and finance. And then I made the decision to come up to 4 schools, and I met Mel Eggers in his office on an August afternoon. And we talked for 3-4 hours, and he said he'd like to have me come and study with him. And so that launched my whole process here. Now, that was a cold call, and I've told this story a little bit in the past, but I believe that initiative is so key. And you've heard a couple of great examples of initiative this afternoon in regards to being in finance, trying to have people not lose their homes, run for mayor. Wonderful initiative. How do you step forward in your own lives and do something that actually changes how you view yourself and your relationship to the world and your community? And I could go on and give you some more background, but I've been very involved in politics, as well as build my company coast to coast on my own capital in Canada. We work with over 1,200 companies, mostly CEOs and presidents. And so I've seen all kinds of innovations. I've seen many, many individuals who didn't even graduate from high school make millions and millions of dollars because they worked hard, they had an idea, they pursued their vision, and they made a lot of cold calls. And they made it happen. So I've watched this over 35 years that I have built this company. And so I'm here because when I was here, I saw citizenship as a bridge concept. I saw it as required because of my experience all across Africa, from Senegal to Nigeria to Nairobi to Entebbe to Dar es Salaam to Lagos. And one of the dilemmas that we have, I believe, is we talk about identity. How do you bridge identity frameworks, whether it's race, ethnic origin, tribe, clan, so forth? If you don't have a concept, the ghettoization of those structures will continue to pervade society. And invariably, the common weal or the common good never really gets addressed. What gets addressed is self-interest of the particular group that's being represented. So at Maxwell, we are talking about having a philosophical understanding and commitment, which is rather altruistic when you try and compare that against the self-interest that drives most individuals and processes. So I'm trying to reinforce the concept that, in fact, until we get this bridge concept built back into the fabric of our thinking and our institutions, so that it is there in front of us all the time, that, in fact, I am here in a process of safety and institutional viability that allows me to make money, that allows me to have safety, that allows me to keep it and build it over time. And in North America, we have institutions in both Canada and the United States that's allowing that. And so how we approach this process of having an understanding that, in fact, it's more than just about self-interest, that our lives and so forth, whether or not we're involved in a particular institution or career or job, until we get outside of ourselves and have a concept that, in fact, we are really multiple people simultaneously acting on our world, both for ourselves and for our society. I believe that that's the key role, and that requires a multiple set of perceptual frames that we have to keep based and rooted in a set of principles that we own and that we are clear about in ourselves. And I thought that your statements in regards to being a mayor and staying above the fray and staying with your principles and providing your will on yourself to stay there in spite of the attacks you took, that speaks volumes, and those are the kinds of principles and ideas that I was trying to promote when Margaret and I funded this session and series of sessions. I hope it continues for many years. I think it can, and I want to thank the institution and Dean for staying with it over time. I think we've had some wonderful sessions, and today I thought was kind of a capstone on the kinds of things that can happen where you have the public and the private frameworks there, demonstrating that this multidisciplinary framework that we have here at the Maxwell School really sets a tone for people to operate as leaders and implementers, whether it's in the public or the private sector. Thank you very much.
All right, I know it's late, and you all have been extraordinarily patient and attentive. I just wanted to wrap this up and let you know there is a reception after, but I kind of wanted to string together my observations of our 3 events that we've had so far. You haven't had the fortune to be at all of them, but as I was thinking about what I heard today, there is a theme that goes through our sessions about the changing role of states and what certain states are doing to be effective at a time when the boundaries around state engagement are changing and the relationship between the state and federal government is changing. And that was a consistent message when we looked at cities, and the relationships between cities and their states are changing, and between cities and their communities are changing. And then the message today about citizenship involvement. And for me, the string that runs through all of those is what you might call retail politics or face-to-face democracy. That states who are succeeding have invested significantly in developing an educated and engaged citizenry. They're taking action to get out and talk to their populations on really challenging policy topics and educate their citizens so that citizens are informed and vote. In cities where there are really creative solutions to public housing and transportation and transit issues, it is the politicians who are getting out and engaging their constituents in a face-to-face way where that relationship is being built, where that trust is being built, where citizens then feel empowered to engage, where success is happening. And today we talked about, Governor Whitman talked about the role of leadership and the duties of citizens to be involved and to be engaged. And for me, that theme comes together. It takes time to build those relationships. It takes time to do that explanation. And it is risky. It is risky for the politicians. It can feel risky for the citizens. So I think as we leave here today, and as we think about, for us, what will be our 4th session, when we look at our government capacity across all levels to really administer governance over critical infrastructure. And we're talking transportation, water, communications, and power. If we don't have those 4, we have a problem with our fabric in our communities. Do we have the capacity as a nation to govern infrastructure? I think this concept for me of face-to-face democracy is a powerful one. Making sure that we're strengthening the institutions and that we're providing a safe space for both our politicians and our citizens to come together to really discuss, to have honest discussions around very, very complex situations and policies, but which we all need to buy into. So, Dave, I so appreciate the participation of the Maxwell School with us today and your support, and Bethany and her team who did all the hard work to pull this together. Mr. Tanner, thank you for endowing the series and for allowing us to just sort of tag along with it today. And to all of you who came, thank you so much, especially the AV crew who's putting this on, and it will be live on our site as soon as we get the video. So thank you all. Please join us for a reception. I know it's late, but there's so much to talk about still. Don't rush away. Thank you all very much.